Hi there, this is John York here again, and we're back to talking about the Consultant Toolkit, which really emphasizes some of the teachings from the McKinsey engagement. We're going to be talking about part 2, which is focus, which is really getting more from what I call the interpersonal to more of the analytics side and the presentation side of things, of good problem solving and good presentation and research to solve those problems so that you can be able to make sure that you are influencing a client. Focus stands for really 5 key points, which is we need to frame, we need to organize material, we need to collect data to fit within that organization, we need to understand what we have collected, means put in perspective, and last but not least, we need to synthesize it and be able to effectively communicate it with business recommendations. So the first thing that you all are going to be doing as part of this class is you're going to be dealing with a scope of work. And so in essence, the problem will be there with your client. Your client has a business problem. It's a marketing issue. And the most important thing you can do is frame it and make sure you get a very tight scope. So framing is critical because if you don't frame it properly, everything that follows is connected, including the conclusions and the recommendations you make. So if you have a very tight scope and you frame things properly, it will lead to a very efficient research process as well as ultimately making recommendations in your action plan that's there. And the key point is that you need to have what we call a key question or hypothesis. So what operationally you need to think about is, you need to identify what is that key question that drives the project. And that should be really based on specific discussions with your client. In fact, your first meeting that you will have with the client will help you frame out the problem and tighten your scope. Because be very honest, is that what will happen is your clients will want the world. They'll have 7, they'll have 10, they'll have 1,000 things they want you to do, and then they'll start shifting. But if you can't focus and frame the problem properly and tightly, what will happen is that you'll get pulled in a lot of different directions. And the 3 key pieces you need to think about when you manage a project is going to be scope at the top. On the other end of the triangle is going to be the time that you have to do. And then third is, we call it money, but it's resources to do it. Whether it's what the client pays or the resources in terms of your time or your own money or efforts that need to be spent to get the project done. So these are very, very key elements to think about, and that's why framing is so important. So let's talk about framing, what you need to think about. You need to think about issues. And in business, it can vary from revenue growth, cost reduction, geographic expansion, merger acquisition, organization, or new product development. And tied to this is a number of key questions. So, since this is a marketing class, probably the second bullet will be most relevant. What's our unique selling proposition? How much we should charge? How can we best communicate? How can we spend our media budget? But I think the strategy piece will be very important as well, about positioning, priorities, payments, performance. And you may find some of these other issues may be helpful, but I think you're going to find the first 2 are going to be very critical. So you start thinking about key issues up front and key questions. And as you start putting together the issues, start thinking about what we call an issues tree. Okay, like what's going on, and here's this situation, and what's our options to consider, and we build it out. And there's a concept called mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. So using an issues tree can help you branch out and look at the different issues that may be facing a client, but also help you ultimately focus on what's the core issue. I use this example from a marketing standpoint because I think I really like it because, it's classic. We need to increase sales. Okay, well, what do? Well, we can do one of three things. We can reduce costs because price is always an issue. It's a major driver. We can improve our strategy in marketing, or we can change our sales strategy. And then with each piece, you can then drill down further. Well, if it is unit cost, then okay, then you have cost of goods issues and production issues and distribution issues that'll affect your unit costs. But if it's marketing, it could be quality packaging, it could be advertising, the strategy, it could be something in the 4 Ps that are there. And then sales strategy could be how the sales force is, or the sales force skill base, or promotion. It could be the tools that you're using. So you can, as you could see very quickly, you can expand out. But it gives you a framework, and I really do encourage you to think about this when you think about your marketing problems, to really hone in on what is most critical. Because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is establish what we call a core hypothesis. If we do X, this is what's going to happen. So the best course of action. So that's what you're trying to think about. Yes or no? What's the best course of action here for this company? It could be, for instance, one of the clients has a pricing program. The best course of action is taking a tiered pricing program for high-value customers at a certain volume. Okay? Yes or no? Now we have to do research to be able to support and then find out where it works and how it works. Another client might have, we believe that the best course of action is to develop a new product line that deals with a identity group. All right, that's great. Well, now we have to research it, and then we have to go forward and look at what the action plan to support that and going forward. So those are just some things to think about as you start framing your problems that are there, and then your work plan. And why that's important is it helps you organize things. So when you organize, the key thing is once you frame the problem properly, you need to think about organizing your analysis in a strategic manner. So one of the tools is a high-level process map, and using frameworks as a starting point to identify what are the issues for analysis. So here's a focused, what we call process map, which is objective, deliverables, and completion map. Sort of tying into your project plan that's there. And I think that this is a good way of mapping out your project. Okay? And then you also will be building a decision tree, which is based off your hypothesis key question. Okay? And from there, again, you're going to be using mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive branches that are there to look at how do we solve the problem. And why that's important is because then you go and do your research. If you're doing market research, if you're collecting data from analytics, your third-party sources, the one key thing you have to keep in mind is if you are too broad, you're not focused, you're going to boil the ocean. And if you think about it, boiling the ocean means that you're going to be spending a lot of time and being very unproductive. So the key is when you collect is you want to prove or disprove your hypothesis, that key question that we already talked about. And as we do this, what we're trying to do is we're already starting to map out our presentation. And there's a great market research article in Harvard Business Review that says, think about your final presentation as you're doing your initial setup. So think about this, and McKinsey uses what we call ghost charts to sort of map out how that final presentation, how that research will be to be able to support that final presentation. And so the ghost charts are going to be very critical. So, here what I want to point out is that, if you are not focused, you could really boil the ocean. And as you see, you could overdo the amount of work that's needed. So one of the things you'll gain from several readings by Barbara Minto, and I think there's another faculty article as well from McKinsey, is what we call the Minto formula. Start with the end of the movie at the beginning. So your recommendations up front. We talk about situation, complication, and then recommendations. That's your up front. And then from there, you have your supportive point 1, supportive side data point 2, point 3, and then your timeline, your action plan, and conclusion. Very logical, to the point. But what's so funny is it's opposite of if you're trained as a scientist. In fact, it's opposite of how many people have been trained. But what's beautiful is that Minto and McKinsey get your recommendations up point, because many executives, they're so busy, they'll remember the first slide or two, and if you get them with the recommendations, you get them hooked. Remember, it's about communication. And so we talked about ghost charts, and as you can see, ghost charts will have one point with a supportive data quote, and that can be pie charts, bar charts, could be quotes from your market research. And as you notice, we'll have headlines as well. And what you'll be doing if you're doing this, it'll help you then in terms of gathering your primary data from your interviews and surveys. And this is just an example of how McKinsey does their interviews. And we'll have a further discussion on interviewing and surveys. And I know you've had some classes in doing voice of customer work. You lay that down along with your secondary data. And that may tie to competitor data, industry data, and market trends that are there. And we'll talk about Get Smart Fast a little bit later on in terms of using key databases from the library. Now you got all the data. Now the key point is, though, so what? What's important and to whom? And you as a consultant, you as a marketing or advertising person, your value is not just delivering, here's what we found, but what are the key takeaways from the research you've done or the programs you're putting together, and to convert them into meaningful insights. This is where you get paid the big bucks. Basically, those insights will form the essence of the answer to the key question that's there. So your rules do involve, it's called the so what and to whom. Not only is key to the firm, but also the key stakeholders. You need to understand that. In many cases, you have owners of firms, so they're going to want to know because the firm health is going to be important. But if you have somebody who is trying to move up the line in an organization, you need to think about what's in it for that stakeholder. You also have to think about other stakeholders who might potentially torpedo your recommendations as well. So what is very critical in terms of looking at your data and your analysis to determine and to be able to hone in on what's ultimately important. So anyway, here's an example in terms of, to whom, looking at different customers or stakeholders that are there and looking at implications and concerns based on the data that were collected. And last but not least is synthesize, which is really pulling it all together. And that is, you've already done your ghost slides and you followed Minto, is now you pull together a specific set of actionable recommendations based on insights that you've gained throughout the engagement. So you'll have this presentation, you'll have your upfront situation, complication, and then you'll have, boom, core recommendations You have your support points for each recommendation, and then have your action plan. Now, what's important is to be able to tell a good story. What's also important is to make sure you have client buy-in. We do consulting, many times what we'll be doing is we'll start being able to share pieces of the story or the outline of the story weeks before that final presentation. So this is something, this is a key pearl that you might want to think about as you're engaging the client. Saying, we're putting together this presentation, let's run by some of the things that we're thinking about. What do you think? You think we're on track? Boom. So that you get buy-in. We did this with the chief operating officer of a major cancer center in the middle of an 8-week engagement. We did it at week 4, and we had actually changed the scope. We had a working presentation, and by doing that, we were able to get key buy-in from him. And then an executive vice president for R&D, our team actually had a presentation the day before the final presentation where we got buy-in and input to the final presentation, because then this way we had advocates that were there and they weren't getting surprised. When you do a presentation, and we'll talk about this later on, is it's about telling a story. And I talk about situation, complication, resolution is very great storyline. You'll hear boy meets girl. There's a few other storylines. But you got to think about a story arc, which is start at the end of the movie. Okay? And you've probably seen these movies where you've had, this catastrophe or this resolution occur, and then they go, let's go back 6 months before this happened. Okay, so you're going to start at the end of the movie, and then you're going to build your story out from there. And, where you started, where you went, what did you do, what did you learn, how did it resolve, how did it end, what's the bottom line. So keep that, and we call that story arc really the journey. So that's something to think about as you build your final presentation, and actually as you do your presentations throughout this class. And here's a classic example of a story arc. Exposition, conflict, tension, rise. So you have the situation, and then the climax, which is like what I call the complication. And then you have resolution of that complication, and the tension falls. And then you have the denouement, which is basically everybody celebrating that they won the Olympics, as we saw with the 1936 sculling team from the University of Washington. So we're back to Agile. We talked about the interpersonal beforehand in terms of talk, evaluate, assist, motivate. I add in there swing, which should be going throughout this whole process. Let's talk a little bit about the analytics side. Early on, framing very, very critical. And then you need to make sure you're organizing that. The framing drives the organization. And as you're organizing your how you're going to do your analysis, how you're going to put your plans together, you're going to start collecting data. That's where you're going to be doing like the slide, the goat slide, and your straw man for your presentation. And as you get this data and you start organizing it, you're going to have to start thinking about, what does it mean? And so what? To whom? And ultimately, as you're pulling this all together, you have to pull it all together and think about the ultimate story you're going to be able to tell. Synthesize. And remember, you may have to pivot as you gather this data and you start thinking about the data, because you may have some learnings that tell you, I may need to get more data because I'm not answering the question, or this may not address the so what. So this is just something to be able to think about in this framework. And at the end of the day, it's about telling the story. So let's make the bottom line here. Let's make the journey a success. I think that from the first piece we talked about team, the importance of team, and your team is going to be very critical. If your team is solid, then you're going to be able to execute. But you also have to have that framework, the analytic framework, to allow you to be able to do, whether it be great consulting or great advertising or great marketing or great problem solving. But having that framework will allow you to approach the problem in a very efficient way. It'll collect your data, but drive it in such a way that you can be able to organize it in a framework that can allow you to tell a great story. So anyway, my pleasure here to be able to share this. I certainly hope you can put it to some use in this class, and I look forward to your questions. So thanks, and we'll see you in class soon.